This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 242 of the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network. This is the first part of a three-part series with two bilingual SLPs, Destiny Johnson and Tiffany Shahoumian-Ruiz, to talk about language evaluations. Destiny and Tiffany are both returning guests. My original episode with Tiffany was on high school language therapy, which is episode 147. And my original episode with Destiny was episode 187 on dynamic assessment. And I wanted to have both of them on again because they are doing some great advocacy work at the state level relating to things like eligibility for language evaluations and cutoff scores. So I wanted to have another conversation with them to talk more about the topic. And the reason I labeled this series, What's the Point of a Language Evaluation, is because one of the things that we talked about is the purpose of evaluations besides diagnosis. A lot of times when people are talking about language evaluations and cutoff scores, they're doing it because they're thinking about diagnosis. However, many times there are other reasons why you might do an evaluation or an assessment. So we talk about those in this series, as well as a number of other topics relating to best practices and advocacy. So I'm sure you'll enjoy this episode. Also, be sure to check the show notes for all of the places you can go to connect with Destiny and Tiffany. Tiffany is actually a Language Therapy Advanced Foundations member, and that is how I originally connected with her. And then she was able to connect me with Destiny. So I was really excited to talk with both of them about all of the work that they're doing on assessments. Before we get going in this episode, be sure to check out Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that gives SLPs and other service providers a system for language therapy. In this program, I give you a framework for creating your language therapy system, creating a system that supports those foundational language skills that are going to support those high-level comprehension skills, build expression, and really help with some of those foundational skills like syntax and vocabulary that are going to set kids up for success in school and in life. So to learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Destiny Johnson and Tiffany Shahoumian-Ruiz. Today, I am joined by Tiffany Shahoumian-Ruiz and Destiny Johnson. So welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
So
you.
both of these are returning guests, and I think we knew this would happen when we scheduled our initial interviews. So we're here bright and early on a Sunday morning. It's actually 6 a.m. in California for Tiffany and Destiny. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, not everybody's up for the weekend interviews, but you guys were like, yeah, let's do it. So I love it.
It works.
Yeah. Why don't we start with some intros and just a little bit of background of your work? Have you, even though you've both been on the show before, and we can obviously link to those interviews, just tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into our conversation.
Okay, I'll start first. So my name is Tiffany Shahoumian-Ruiz. I'm a SLP. I've been one for about 20 years. I would say what makes me tick is just trying to continue to become the best SLP that I can and make sure that my clients and my families um, are given accurate information, the best treatment, and specifically assessment and diagnosis is really one of my passions.
Yeah, which obviously we're going to talk a lot about that today. But so you
Yes.
are in the high school setting right now, and
Actually, no, I've actually made a switch.
okay,
I am currently in elementary schools only. It
okay,
kind of, yeah, I made the switch. I requested, or I told, people that I work with that I was open to a change, because I've been recently focusing a lot of my work around, differential diagnosis,
hmm,
DLD. And I found that that differential diagnosis of typically developing or language disorder was more, I guess, happening at the elementary
yeah.
versus high school when it's kind of solidified a little bit
You
more.
would hope it's happening more
Yeah.
at the elementary school. But I know, obviously, as we talked about in our previous interview, when you were at a high school, that we have to know how to identify it when it hasn't been identified yet. It's
True.
secondary as
True.
well.
True.
So, yeah. So, Destiny, do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am the CEO and founder of Multimodal Communication Speech Clinic, and we contract with the regional center as well as school settings. And at this current time, I am completing the Spanish portions of assessments where I am collaborating with clinicians, and I am bilingual. I speak English and Spanish, and one of my biggest passion is just making sure that we are giving fair and equitable assessments, using fair and equitable assessment practices for our culturally and linguistically diverse students. And another passion of mine is dynamic assessment. And I did want to share that right now I'm taking an implementation science course to complete my doctorate, my SLPD at Northwestern. So I'm really excited to bring that information to help bridge that gap between research and practice.
So you mentioned the word implementation science, which I was actually talking about this with my supervisor the other day at work because there's a lot of big initiatives that we're working on right now. And we're talking about sometimes there's a really good idea and it might be, quote, evidence-based, but if you don't have the right infrastructure in place and the right supports in place, then it doesn't get implemented. So how do you define implementation science and what are you learning about in your program?
So I just started this week, but if I can define implementation science is how to identify the barriers as well as the facilitators that will encourage clinicians to engage in more evidence-based practices. There's a lot of barriers that clinicians are facing, and it's important for there to be a lot more collaboration between researchers and clinicians to help
Hmm.
identify why certain practices are not being integrated. And for example, one of the topics that I'm passionate about, and it was the huge motivator for why I wanted to take this class, is why is dynamic assessment not being implemented as much
Yeah.
as it should? We have the evidence, but it's not being implemented as much.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I can just think about, again, things that are happening in my position right now where there's protocols that were designed by researchers that are being done in the field or supposed were intended to be done in the field, and this is more in social work rather than speech pathology, but because they're so laborious, the caseworkers don't want to do them. And I think there's not buy-in, but then I also think that sometimes did it make sense to even put those protocols in place to begin with? Or is there another way we could be evidence-based and collecting the right information, but also making it feasible for people who are actually using these assessments, which honestly, that's probably the biggest objection that I get to dynamic assessment from the clinicians. It's not that they don't think it's evidence-based, it's that they think, how do I do this right?
And how do I have time to do it? Now, obviously, there's other objections from administrators, but that's another part of the conversation. So, yeah. I'm wondering what you both have seen as far as the objections from clinicians who maybe know the dynamic assessment is good practice, but aren't doing it.
I think one of them being the fact that scores are not being used or reported. And I
Yeah.
understand that they are constrained by current policies that perhaps are requiring them to use a score, which in itself is also an important topic and conversation to be had, because a lot of the times, a lot of these school districts or states are encouraging the use of an arbitrary cut score, which is concerning and it's no longer evidence-based practice.
Hmm. Yeah. Are you seeing that as well, Tiffany?
Yeah, what I've also seen as the SLPs will have to kind of extract the information, extract the principles from journal articles often to find out
Hmm.
how dynamic assessment was performed, what they did, how often they did it, um, and how to interpret the information. And I found that it's not, it's just a little time consuming for clinicians
Yeah.
to extract that information and create their own little form. I mean, it's getting better. It's getting better, but that's the barrier I've seen.
Hmm.
It's not as packaged as some of our norm reference standardized tests. It doesn't
Yeah.
come in a nice little box with a 1, 2, 3, check this.
Hmm.
Hmm.
That,
And I,
yeah, go ahead.
and I also don't think there is an agreed upon framework of
Hmm.
of how to perform a dynamic assessment. So I think that's also another barrier as well.
Hmm. I think the framework is really important because if you don't have a framework, it seems too loosey-goosey. And then it's hard to sell to other people who aren't in the field. But then also, I've gotten that objection from clinicians as well, where they think, oh, it's just like when you say that you're going to do an assessment that doesn't use a norm reference test. People use this word informal, which I don't like the word informal. I think something can be standardized or non-standardized. It can be qualitative or quantitative, but informal, that doesn't give you any information and it makes it sound less rigorous when in fact it can be quite rigorous. There can be an agreed upon protocol. And I think sometimes with clinicians, we have so many decisions that we need to make, we get decision fatigue. And if you don't have an agreed upon protocol and one thing feels really hard, there's all this ambiguity in how to do it. And then here's this other thing that's nice and safe and clearly defined and concrete. When you're really busy and stressed, which one are you going to default to? You're going to default to what you know and what's comfortable. So, yeah.
I just want to mention there are a couple, there is one actual dynamic assessment test that is out,
Yeah.
the Diamond by Douglas Peterson. I've used it a couple times. I'm still getting more comfortable with it, but that is a packaged deal and it's
Hmm.
based on some good principles. There's also Dr. Elizabeth Pena and
Hmm.
forgetting the other author, but there are some other scales that have
Yeah.
been packaged a little bit more, make it easier
Hmm.
for SLPs to apply.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a couple, yeah.
So I know that we started talking about cut scores just a minute ago, and I want to get into specifics because I know both of you are involved in some advocacy work with specific state level initiatives, but which also involves looking at what other states are doing. But I thought maybe we could start off with just a conversation around why. Why is this important? How does this impact the clients that we're working with? What are the consequences of having an arbitrary cut score, not having clear, consistent protocols that are widely accepted among clinicians, among leadership? What's the impact? So maybe if I think since both of you are working with students and seeing the impact, could you share some examples of stories or case studies from clients that you've worked with?
So I can go first and talk about one case in which um, a child was given an expressive one word as well as the subtest from the self-5. And based on the specific scores, because currently the state regulation states that if they score above the 7th percentile, can't qualify under speech or language impairment. So there's this belief that, okay, if this child scores above the 7th percentile on either of these two tests, then they're not able to qualify. So unfortunately, they were looking at the subtest scores as well as the scores from the expressive one word, and this child was about to not qualify. So I had to step in and advocate for the student. And this also brought up several concerns of perhaps because there is this arbitrary cut score of 7th percentile, clinicians are not able to make accurate diagnostic decisions or are not able to use the cut score, the test specific cut score from that specific test.
So they were 7th percentile on the entire test or on a subtest?
It was a subtest, which also did bring up other concerns.
Mm-hmm.
So, it really brings light into just our confidence and whether this is an area that perhaps we can continue to grow in of how to appropriately use these tests. So this was an important area for me to discuss important topics. So yes, unfortunately, this is based on the subtest. They were not about to qualify because the regulations were set up in a certain way, and clinicians need to abide by these regulations, and that's really concerning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so I would always use subtests for information. So like, does this give me an idea about a goal I could work on? Does this give me an idea about something else I could look further into with another assessment? And or other, when I say assessment, I don't necessarily just mean another test, but something I might want to probe into further. Like I can think of, for example, something I talk a lot about is the sentence repetition subtests. So yeah, I might look at that and say, I don't know if this is a working memory issue. Is it a syntax issue? So I'm going to use that information, but then I'm going to do additional probes and not just rely on that one score, but I'm going to use the score to guide me in the right direction, not making just like a black and white decision right here about whether or not the student qualifies just from that score. So, and I know I would always look at the entire test score if I was going to look at a score. So the standard score, not the subtest score. And again, the subtests are just information. They're not cut scores, or at least that's how I looked at it. So you're
I
saying
think
that
that's
you can look
important.
at just the subtest and use that as a cut score, or they're encouraging clinicians to do that?
I think there is limited information as to whether that is appropriate. I'm unsure if they're even aware. However,
Yeah.
we continue to quote because even on the report, the template reports, we see the regulations quoted on there, and it states using 2 standardized tests, which is another problem in itself.
Yeah. Yeah, we
Or
would have that
using
too.
Yeah, or 1 standard test in a language sample in that 7th percentile, which is that it's very arbitrary because we need to consider test specific cut scores. So I think this is an opportunity for more education in this topic matter, which is also why Tiffany and I were very encouraged and passionate about wanting to talk about this topic.
Yeah. Okay, so it says it's 2 standard scores and then a language sample is what it is that's in California.
It can be one test with a standard score and a language sample,
Mm-hmm.
or 2 tests.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Or you can use alternative methods if you decide
Yeah.
ahead of time that that's needed, but that's another subject right there.
Yeah, for sure. I remember Gosh, yeah, I'm thinking of all these different ways we could go with this because I know there's a lot of topics we wanted to talk about. Now that we're saying we've got cut scores, we've got what does it look like when you're saying that people can use two tests or that they have to use two tests? I know how that was interpreted in Illinois and in the district I used to work at. So maybe we could go that direction. But how it was interpreted for in my district was you need at least two standard scores. So what would sometimes happen is that we'd have one and it would be like, okay, they came out, they're not low enough in this area, and people would like keep giving tests until they could get at least two standard scores. They wouldn't cancel each other out per se, but a lot of times people would feel like they needed to keep testing until they got, proof from these norm reference assessments, which would mean that sometimes you could have been spending that time doing other assessment procedures that would give you more rich descriptive information in addition to the standard scores that you did have, but instead they spent that time doing more tests. So that's how it was sometimes interpreted, which again, sometimes people were able to get the information and the descriptive information they needed, but other times it was, kind of trying to fit a what is it, round peg in a square hole or whatever.
Right. And one thing I'd like to mention is that if you keep on giving those tests, right? Like, oh, let me give a test about figurative language. Let me give a test about inferencing, or let me give you another vocabulary test. It's not that those tests can't give you good information, but we have to take that information and see if there's what evidence is there for us to use it to diagnose language disorders. Does it have the robust power to actually do that? Or is it just another piece of information?
Yeah.
So, if it's okay with you, I'd just like to review a little bit about what we're required.
Yes. Yeah.
What we're required to use. So IDEA 2004 requires that we use technically sound instruments that may assess the relative contributions of different, cognitive behavioral factors. And in our case, it's mostly language that we're looking at, right? I used to see that in reports all the time. I used a technically sound instrument, blah, blah, blah. Well, what does that actually mean? It's referring to validity and reliability for the most part. Now, I know I'm just going to review a little bit about what I probably learned 20 years ago about validity and reliability, just to, kind of refresh people's memory. And then possibly maybe Destiny can talk about, take it a little bit further, because there's a validity framework that we like to talk about.
Yeah.
So,
that'd be great.
So validity refers to the degree of which the evidence, judgment, or theory support the interpretation of test scores as a measure of what it claims to measure. So, how well does our evidence support use of that test to what? Diagnose a language disorder, identify a language impairment. And then there's those different types of test validity that y'all remember, like construct validity. Does it actually measure what it's intending to measure? Content validity, criterion validity, and face validity, right? And then we have reliability, which is just the test ability to yield consistent, similar results. So if you gave it multiple times, would you get the same results? Or if multiple SLPs gave it, would the test produce similar scores or results? And maybe Destiny can talk a little bit about the validity framework, because that really is the most important type of validity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, what we're getting at is that there's different reasons to give a test. You can give a test to get information about how to write treatment goals and report progress updates and get, rich descriptive information. But then you can also use a test for a diagnosis, and those are different things.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, which is something that the article by Daub et al. Does mention in terms of adopting of a validity framework mindset. So when it comes to validity, it's not necessarily the test in itself that are valid. It's really more so our decisions that we are making when we are using this test that is the validity that should be considered. So we need to be collecting the evidence that's going to support our decisions. And one of them being, well, why are we using this test? Because we know that there are tests designed to make this distinction, this differentiation of, okay, this child has a language impairment or not. And then also, there are tests that are for determining change in skills. And then there are also tools that are helpful for determining severity or level of function. So just knowing what factors that we need to look for will support us in our decision making. So it's really the decisions in itself that should be valid.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links where you can go to learn about all of the great resources that we mentioned in this episode, as well as where you can go to learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs and other professionals working on language to create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about the program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. As always, thank you so much for listening. It helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you found this useful, please feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues. If you are interested in being a guest, if you would like to invite me to be a guest on your show, or if you have a suggestion for a guest, please send me an email at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.